Hello students, and welcome to your Thursday class lecture online. So we're going to cover some more of chapter 5 today, some more measurement reliability and validity. We covered quite a bit of it on Tuesday, so this may not take the full class lecture time, but let's get started. So again, a quick announcement that next Thursday is our first exam, so that'll be over chapters 1 through 5. We will be reviewing in class on Tuesday. We'll still have normal labs that day, so there will still be the lab assignments. Your annotated bibliography 3 is due that day, Tuesday and Thursday of that week for your labs. I will also upload the study guide this weekend, and there is currently a discussion board on Titanium that you can use to discuss any questions that you have over the chapter, and peers can answer it, I can answer it, and feel free to email me questions as well. So those are just a couple resources for your help in studying for the exam. Alright, so quickly we're going to go over validity, measurement scales, and then we'll get into lab for those of you who have lab for Thursday. So first, we saw a few of these slides. Excuse me, we saw a few of these slides, but we didn't get a chance to go over all of them completely. So since we didn't get a chance to fully cover them, I wanted to go over them again. So construct validity is the primary validity that I've used as an example since the beginning of the course. Does the scale that you have, or the measure that you have, is it measuring what you think it's measuring? So the specific technical definition in your book is, does the operational definition reflect the true theoretical meaning of the variable? So as an example, purpose is very related to meaning. They're overlapping constructs. Purpose is meaning plus goal orientation and self-transcendence. So you want your scale of purpose, if you have a measure of purpose, to be measuring purpose and not meaning. An example of meaning or like finding meaning in life, or something that could be meaningful to you, is a walk through nature. It can be really meaningful for you. Maybe watching a sunset on the beach. A purpose is a goal-oriented, meaningful goals that you have that are beyond yourself. So things for other people, things for nature, things for your family, things that are beyond yourself. They'll also help you because obviously they're meaningful to you, but they are for the good of others. So protecting nature, for example, maybe protecting our beaches is a thing that could be a purpose to you. Helping serve impoverished children could be a purpose for some of you. Teaching can be a very purposeful activity. It's something that's meaningful to you, that also gives you goals, long-term and short-term goals. Like short-term, probably get your bachelor's degree here. Long-term, maybe a master's degree. Very long-term, maybe you'll be an administrator. Who knows? And so that is beyond yourself, or self-transcendent, so that's for other people. So those goals are so you can help teach and train and build children throughout the rest of your life. So construct validity is our scale of purpose actually measuring purpose rather than measuring meaning? So there's two pieces of construct validity. One of them is content validity. So does the measure, the content validity is basically, does the measure have all the components, the symptoms, or most parts of the construct in the measure? So for example, if you're looking at a measure of depression, you would want to have most of the symptoms of depression in your measure. So you would ask about people feeling lethargic, or ask about people feeling sad, or ask about people feeling like they didn't want to talk to their friends and family. So those are all like common symptoms, and so you would want to make sure that your measure is getting at all those things, plus the others. So for purpose, as our example, we've got those three components: the beyond the self, or self-transcendence, that personal meaning, and goal orientation. So we would want the content of our measure to hit each of those pieces. So that's what content validity, it's a part of construct validity. Another part of construct validity is face validity. And so this is used a lot in the literature. It's maybe used a little more than I think it should be, but it's really simple to understand. Does a measure look like or appear like it's measuring what it's supposed to measure? So this is often used in the literature when a researcher will send their measure to some experts in the field. Say I might have sent our measure of purpose to some experts in purpose and just ask, okay, does this look like it's measuring these 3 aspects of purpose? And then you send it to 4 experts, all 4 of them say, yes, it looks great. So you put that in your paper, you say, well, it looks like our scale has face validity. All the experts agree, it looks like it's going to get at what we're trying to get at. So you can look at these example questions from the Claremont Purpose Scale and you can decide, does it look like it has face validity yourself? So read those really quickly, or read a few of them and ask yourself, do these questions look like they're getting at goal orientation, personal meaningfulness, that beyond the self component? Do they ask what you think of when you hear about a purpose in life? So that determination is up to you. Do you think that it has face validity or do you not? So if it looks like it's measuring what it's supposed to measure, if it looks to you like it's measuring purpose, then it might have face validity for you. And it's used a lot more than I think it should be in the literature, in the sense that just looking like it's going to measure the right thing doesn't mean that it's going to, because it might actually only be measuring meaning, for example. You don't know that unless you do an empirical test for it. We are becoming scientists after all. So just looking at it and saying, yeah, it looks good, I don't think is a high enough bar. So more types of validity. Predictive validity, this one's pretty easy to understand, is basically, does a scale or does any measure predict accurately? So for example, an SAT or GRE prep test is supposed to be predicting, like telling you what you would actually be getting on the GRE or the SAT. So let's say you took the SAT prep test and you got, I don't remember the range of scores for SAT, let's say you got a 1400 on the SAT prep test. That would hopefully be predictive of you getting around a 1400 on the actual SAT. So you could have a test that has predictive validity for many different things. So not every scale would need to have predictive validity, but if it's useful for you, if that's the kind of scale that you're making, predictive validity would be important. All right, another one is convergent validity. This is basically testing if a measure is showing the same thing at the same time as another measure of that same construct. So we have our measure of purpose, for example. It should be highly correlated with other measures of purpose. Like obviously we think ours is better for whatever reasons, but it should be correlated with the previous measures of purpose. So that would go for a new depression scale. Let's say you want to make a new scale of depression covering more of the symptoms. Well, even though you're getting at more of the symptoms now, and you think it's doing a better job at capturing the picture of depression, it still should be highly correlated with previous measures of depression. So an example could also be, you have an attachment scale that should be highly correlated or converging with an attachment observation. So that's convergent validity. Discriminant validity is, we mentioned this a little on Tuesday, but it's that your measure should not be related to things that it's not theoretically related to. So for example, our scale of purpose, maybe a scale of attachment, probably shouldn't be related to agoraphobia symptoms or obsessive compulsive symptoms. So it just shouldn't be related to that. Not a negative correlation or a positive correlation, but just no correlation at all. There should be no relationship. So if you looked at the graphs that we've drawn on the board and you see in your books, it would just be kind of like a mess of dots all over the place in the XY axis. So it shouldn't be related. It's not that it's negatively related. For example, purpose in life is negatively related to depression, if you have purpose, you're less likely to be depressed. That's not what it's talking about. That would actually be another type of validity, showing that it is related in the expected ways to that measure. But this is saying that your measure should not be related to things that it shouldn't be related to. So you could think of attachment or parenting style. Parenting style should probably not be related to your fear of going to the dentist, for example. So things like that. And that just shows that your measure is not just relating with everything randomly, and it shows that it's actually relating with what you want it to be related to. So incremental validity. So I mentioned the example of you creating a new depression scale. So you want your depression scale to get all the components of depression, and you feel the previous scales of depression don't get at all the kinds of symptoms that you could possibly have. So incremental validity is basically saying, does your scale perform better than the other measures in some way? So you're expecting that now your scale of depression is getting at such and such a symptom, whereas the other one did not. So you can do studies to show that, yes, it actually is getting at those. So those are a couple other types of validity that I wanted to let you know, and it's really related to reliability, remember, because you first need a scale that's consistent, that's getting the same measurement each time before you can have it be valid. All right, another important thing with the measures, especially with what you're writing, your own measures that you're creating for the survey we're doing as a class, is reactivity. And so broadly, this is a change of behavior due to awareness of being measured. I was actually trying to find a little clip from the movie The Lost World, Jurassic Park. There's a part in it where the paleontologist, when they first get to the island and they're looking at the dinosaurs, she says, we've got to not even bend a blade of grass. We've got to bend them back again so that these animals don't know we're here. It's kind of the same thing with people. We want to measure the people in their natural state. We don't want people knowing that they're being measured, because that might change the way that they behave. So specifically, studies have been done in psychology that show when a participant realizes what you're trying to study, they might help you or they might hinder you. So if they're upset with the study, if they're annoyed with the questions you're asking, if it's been too long and they're bored, they might actually deliberately try to answer the wrong way to mess up your study. Some other people might want to be really helpful and inadvertently mess up your study too, because it causes measurement error. You're not getting at their true score anymore. So remember that reliability, or your observed score, so whatever score this person gets is made up of a true score representing maybe IQ and then measurement error. So something else that could be reactive is not including someone's ethnicity or gender in a scale. That could make them really upset and change their behavior on the rest of your survey. So make sure as you're writing items that it's not something that's going to trigger people. I'm sure you've all heard of trigger warnings. So try to make items as you're creating them or finding them that are not going to make people reactive, that are not going to make them say, oh, well, that item was very uncomfortable. I don't want to take the next part of the survey. All right, so let's move on to measurement scales. We'll talk about the nominal kind of measurement scales, ordinal, interval, and ratio. So starting with nominal scales, you can think of nominal as named scale, because that's pretty much all it is. It's when you have categories or groups that differ. So you might name it with numbers, you might name it with letters, but the numbers that you use aren't actual quantitative measurements. So for example, here we have a gender variable. So we have male, female, and other. So we might code male as 1, female as 2, other as 3. So scoring 3 doesn't mean you're more or higher gendered. It's just a label, a name. So that's what a nominal scale is. And so that's used in a lot of demographic variables. You'd use that for ethnicity as well. Because you wouldn't measure if you're, I guess if you are actually doing research on genealogy or genetics or something, you might actually test how much Asian versus American DNA you have, or so as an example. But in most cases, you're just using these numbers as a name to code it. Alright, so ordinal builds off nominal because it still gives it a name, but now it adds a rank to the ordering. So grades are an example of an ordinal scale. So A minus, B plus, B. So that is still, it's still giving a name to your grade, an A or a B or a C, but now it's in an order. So a grade is higher or better than a B grade. Another example would be ranking someone's attractiveness from 1 to 10, or ranking a movie out of 5 stars. So you give a movie 3 stars versus 5 stars. That's saying the 5-star movie is better than the 3-star, but it's not the same as an interval scale, which we'll get to next. So the increased numbers mean increase something, but the difference between a 2 and a 3-star movie is not necessarily the same difference quantitatively or qualitatively as between a 4 and a 5. So you've got a 2-star movie and a 3-star movie. That's saying the 3-star is a little better, but the difference between a 4-star movie and a 5-star movie might be much more dramatic. You need a lot better movie to go from 4 to 5 than maybe from a 2 to 3, for example. So that brings us to interval scale. So this builds off the nominal and ordinal because it's got names and it's in an order, but now it adds a meaningful difference between these numbers. So we have a difference between 1 and 2 in this kind of scale, and it's the same as the difference between 3 and 4. So an example is temperature on a Celsius or Fahrenheit measure. Most psychology scales, so you can't say a person who scores 20 on an adult attachment scale is doubly as attached as someone who scores 10 because you don't have a 0 point to compare it off of. And we'll get into that next with ratio scales. But you can say that the difference between 20 degrees and 40 degrees is the same amount of difference, like the same amount of heat increase as the difference between 40 and 60 degrees. So going from 20 to 40, jumping those 20 degrees, that's adding as much heat as you are adding from 40 to 60 degrees. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about an interval scale. Most psychology scales, and you might get some argument about this, some people might say most psychology scales are actually ratio. I think that they better are described as interval. Especially when you have like a Likert scale where you've got 7 items, you have strongly disagree on one side, strongly agree on the other side, and then neutral in the middle, which is what I hope you try to do for your scales that you create. You can assume that these differences between score of 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, that those are all the same jump. Probably is not actually accurate for every person who takes it, mainly because people tend not to put the very far scores. So people don't tend to put 7 strongly agree and don't tend to put 1 strongly disagree. So the jump to 7 and 1 is actually probably better described as an ordinal scale, but we still use the data as an interval scale. So it's a little weakness of the research for sure, but most psychology scales are interval scales, so the difference between a score of 2 and 4 on a Likert scale is the same as the difference between a 5 and 7. Alright, so the next one we want to talk about is ratio scales. So this builds on all the previous scales that we talked about, including the interval scale. So it's giving a name to things, there's an order to the scale, there's also equal intervals between the numbers, but this adds with that an absolute 0 point. So the 0 point is just an absolute absence of the variable being measured. So some examples are height, you could be 0 inches, weight, you could have no weight, reaction time, I mean theoretically you could have a reaction time of 0, that you react immediately. a rate of responding. So if you're if your measure is how many words are you recalling from the paragraph that you just read, it's possible that you might not remember any of the words. So that's what a 0 point and a ratio scale is. So you're counting those up, those words that you're remembering. So that might be a spelling test for kids in school. It might be a ratio scale. So you're saying you remembered how to spell 0 of the words versus you remembered how to spell all 10 of the words. All right, so you could consider some survey measures a ratio scale, but I think it's more likely that they're interval or ordinal, because it's hard to say that a theoretical construct does have a 0 point in some cases, and also a lot of our scales are going from example 1 to 7, so you can't say if people score 1 on everything that they strongly disagree. It doesn't mean that they necessarily don't have, say, a purpose in life. When they're saying, I strongly disagree that I found meaning in my life, doesn't mean that they really don't have it. It just means that they're reporting that they don't, and that they probably have some kinds of signs. They probably do have some things that make their life meaningful, some goals. So for some constructs, it's hard to say that there is an actual 0 point. So I would say most psychological surveys are interval scales. All right, so really quick, nominal scale is the naming of a scale. Ordinal is when you put an order to those things, so like the grades A, B, C, and D. Interval is when you have equal intervals between the numbers, so the distance between a 2 and a 4 is the same as between a 4 and a 6. And then ratio is adding a 0 point. So an example of going back really quick to interval scales, the Celsius and Fahrenheit measure of temperature. If you're familiar with measures of temperature, Celsius and Fahrenheit have a 0 in them, but they're not actually indicating 0 heat, because there's still some heat there. I mean, it's just at a freezing point, for example, with Celsius, I believe, and maybe I'm getting them confused, but I think a 0 degrees Celsius is water's freezing point. If I'm wrong, it's because I'm American and we don't use Celsius here. So that's an example, but you could say that the temperature scale of kelvins is a ratio scale, because that actually does have a 0 point, because there is a theoretical possibility to have 0 heat. So if you're measuring temperature in kelvins, you are measuring on a ratio scale. So if you're familiar with physics or chemistry, maybe that helps connect that for you. So if you are still confused, please watch this YouTube video. It kind of gives some other examples about, especially in kind of a survey context. So you don't need to watch this video. I would recommend it though. It might help you connect these types of scales. And that link is in the PowerPoint, which you can download, or you can also find this link as well on the PDF for this lesson. But that is all for the lecture today. Like I said, we covered quite a bit of it in Tuesday for Chapter 5, and we've been talking about reliability and validity for a while. So I hope that it's becoming more understandable and that you're feeling more and more ready for the exam. You're connecting these topics that we've talked about in the first couple weeks. So definitely email me if you have any questions before the exam. I will have the study guide up this weekend. Use the discussion board that I put on Titanium so that you can talk to each other about questions. And thank you for attending an online lecture. I hope it was enjoyable and you learned a few things and you were able to pay attention. Remember, if you want to, you can watch that little video. And for those of you in the lab, continue watching the next video in the playlist for your lab lecture. And we'll talk about finding and creating survey measures for us to use for our class project. Thank you.